Ezra 8. These are the family heads and those registered with them who came up with me from Babylon during the reign of King Artaxerxes. Of the descendants of Phinehas, Gershom, that's a priest, of course, Phinehas being the priest. Of the descendants of Ithamar, Daniel's another priestly line. Those are the ones who didn't get the high priest title, but they were also priests. Of the descendants of David, Hattush. Of the descendants of Shechaniah. So we have two lines of priests here, and the royal line. Now Zerubbabel was also a descendant of David. In fact, Zerubbabel is the one who is listed in Jesus' genealogy. The beginning of the book of Matthew. After the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, Zerubbabel the father of Abuad, and blah 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 blah. Okay. But this is another son, another member of the line of David. Now, the reason why this is important is because Ezra is trying to configure his journey from Babylon to Jerusalem as a sort of second Exodus. Okay, there's a lot of, and this will be true throughout the rest of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, there's a lot of deliberate callbacks to the law of Moses and to the Israelites' initial journey out of captivity from Egypt to the Promised Land. And so he is trying to kind of evoke memories of that and deliberately cast him and the caravan with him as inheritors of that legacy of being part of an exodus out of a land of captivity and to the Promised Land. Now, they'd already come back from captivity a couple generations ago by this point, but he is trying to kind of configure his journey and the journey that they made with him in the mold of Israel's journey out of Egypt to the Promised Land. So they're going to have 12 tribes, 12 families here. Now, these are not all members of the 12 tribes of Israel, but Ezra is trying to show that all Israel is represented in this journey, this second exodus out of captivity. Of the descendants of Parosh, Zechariah, and with him are registered 150 men. Of the descendants of Pahath, Moab, Eleohanal, son of Zariah, and with him 200 men. Of the descendants of Zatu, Shechariah, son of Jahaziel, and with him 300 men. Of the descendants of Adin, Ebed, son of Jonathan, and with him 50 men. Of the descendants of Elam, Jeshaiah, son of Athaliah, and with him 70 men. Of the descendants of Shephatiah, Zebadiah, son of Michael, and with him 80 men. Of the descendants of Joab, Obadiah, son of Jehiel, and with him 218. That's a very specific number. Of the descendants of Bani, Shelomith, son of Josephiah, and with him 160 men. Of the descendants of Bebai, Zechariah, son of Bebai, and with him 28 men. Of the descendants of Asgad, Johanan, son of Hakatan, and with him 110 men. Of the descendants of Adonikam, the last ones, whose names were Eliaphilet, Juel, and Shemaiah, and with them 60 men. Of the descendants of Bigbai, Uthai, and Zachar, and with them 70 men. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 family groups he's listed here. Don't know what tribes they're from, but there's not a tribe from each of the 12 actual tribes of Israel. There's not a family, I'm positive of that. But he's trying to demonstrate that all of Israel is by including those 12 families, plus the priests, both priestly families, both the high priest family and the regular priest family, and the royalty of Line of David. He's trying to demonstrate that all of Israel is represented in this Exodus, even though that isn't really true. Okay, all of Israel really isn't here, because we don't have representatives from all 12 tribes. We just have 12 family units, but they're not represented in all 12 tribes. So we're trying to act like they are. That's essentially what's going on here. I assembled them at the canal that flows towards Ahava, and we camped there 3 days. So they knew this was happening. This was a big venture that had been set upon and planned upon ahead of time. When I checked among the people and the priests, I found no Levites there. So they have 2 priestly clans, but no non-priestly Levite clans. That's a problem. So I summoned. He wants all of Israel to be represented. It's not really a problem so much, and they already have some Levites and temple workers there in Jerusalem. But Ezra really wants all of Israel to be represented symbolically in this journey. So they have the 2 priestly families. They have a member of the royal family. They have 12 other families representing the 12 tribes of Israel, even though they're really not the 12 tribes of Israel. But they don't have any regular Levites, and he needs that. He needs some. So I summoned Eleazar, Ariel, Shemaiah, Elnathan, Jarib, Elnathan, Nathan, Zechariah, and Meshullam, who were leaders, and Joarib and Elnathan, another Elnathan, must be a common name at this time, who were men of learning, and I sent them to Iddo, the leader, in Casaphia, whatever that is. I told them what to say to Iddo and his kinsmen, the temple servants in Casaphia, so they might bring attendance to us for the house of our God. The Levites are the ones who did the blue-collar work, so the priests could focus on the priestly duties, the burning of the incense and the altar sacrifices and things like that. The Levites, the rest of the Levites couldn't do that, but they would literally do like the hard stuff. They would carry the stuff around. They would build stuff. They were the blue-collar guys. In our day and time, that's what we would call them. Because the gracious hand of our God was on us, they brought us Sherebiah, a capable man, from the descendants of Mali, son of Levi, the son of Israel, and Sherebiah's sons and brothers, 18 men, and Hashabiah, together with Jeshiah from the descendants of Merari, another Levite, another son of Levi, and his brothers and nephews, 20 men. They also brought 220 of the temple servants, a body that David and the officials had established to assist the Levites. All were registered by name. We read about that at the end of the book of 1 Chronicles. A lot of people think that the books of Ezra and Nehemiah were compiled together by the same guy who compiled the Chronicles. If that's true, then it means that 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah were all ultimately compiled by the same dude, which just seems very likely, because there's a lot of overlap between the contents of those 4 books. And one of the things that's common to them is this feature of David's contribution to the Israelite worship service. And he set up the temple. He didn't build the temple, but he set up the temple. Solomon built the temple, but he implemented the worship system that David had devised. Now, we don't read about that in Samuel or in Kings. But their temple worship system largely came from the mind of David. God had given the law to Moses, and he had given the sacrificial system and the priesthood, the instructions for that through Moses. But David set up a lot of the mechanisms of how that was going to be operated when they got into the temple. And God apparently allowed that to be the case. He allowed David's instructions to be binding on the Israelites from that point onward. So that's what we only read about that in 1 Chronicles. Like, we don't read about that in Samuel or Kings. So, but the chronicler is concerned with that, and the guy who compiled Ezra and Nehemiah is concerned with that too, which again kind of hints to the fact that it might be the same dude. There, by the Ahava Canal, I proclaimed a fast, so that we might humble ourselves. See, he's got them all. He's got all of the people he needs. He's got the 2 priestly families, the royal family, 12 other families. Now he's got some temples, so now he's got some Levites and some temple workers. So now he's got all Israel represented in his caravan. So there, by the Ahava Canal, I proclaimed a fast, so that we might humble ourselves before our God and ask him for a safe journey for us and our children with all our possessions. They're going with their families. They're uprooting themselves and they're going somewhere else. Like, this is not a vacation. Okay. Now, I think it's possible that some of these Levites and temple workers, they were recruited on the spur of the moment. They may have thought this was temporary, maybe. Because he's basically asking them to make a 1,000-mile journey with him to Jerusalem on the spur of the moment. It's possible that to them this was temporary. They were there to be part of this symbolic trip back to Israel, and then they were going to go back to wherever they were living. I don't know. But to Ezra, this is permanent. To Ezra and the other guys who were part of this group ahead of time, this is permanent. Like this is. They got their families, they got their children, they got their. Now they're not. The wives and the children are not counted in the list we just read. They never are. But they've got. This is a permanent. They've got their wives, they got their children, they've got their family possessions, they've got their money, they got all their stuff. Like this is not temporary. So I gathered them there by the Ahava Canal, proclaimed a fast, so we might humble ourselves before our God, and ask him for a safe journey for us and for our children with all our possessions. I was ashamed to ask the king for soldiers and horsemen to protect us from enemies on the road, because we had told the king, the gracious hand of our God is on everyone who looks to him, that his great anger is against all who forsake him. So we fasted and petitioned our God about this, and he answered our prayer. So he did not, I'm assuming the king offered him a military escort, and he declined, saying that his God, he wanted to prove that his God was on him, his hand of God was on him by escorting him safely to Jerusalem, despite not having any defensive units with him. And remember, this is a land that's in revolt. Okay, Egypt is in revolt right now. And there's always a threat of bandits on the road. And they're going to be bringing a lot of stuff with them. As we read about here next, they have a lot of money with them. This would have been a very desirable caravan to attack. Now, Nehemiah, when he goes there later on, will have a unit of soldiers with him. We'll talk about that when we get there. So, simply not having an armed escort was not a problem. But Ezra is a religious reformer, not a civil or political reformer. And he had staked his marriage on claiming that his God would protect him on his journey. And apparently he got the king to believe that. So it's important then for them to make it there safely so the king will know that Israel's God was with them on their way. Then I set apart 12 of the leading priests, together with Shariah, Hashabiah, and 10 of their brothers. And I weighed out to them the offering of silver and gold, and the articles that the king, his advisors, his officials, and all Israel present there had donated for the house of our God. I weighed out to them 650 talents of silver articles weighing 100 talents, 100 talents of gold, 20 bowls of gold valued at 1,000 derricks, and 2 fine articles of polished bronze, as precious as gold. And there's all kinds of footnotes there explaining how much that weighed and how much that was worth. I don't know. You always have to be suspicious of numbers, because numbers are one of the most common things that had errors committed when the copy is copied them. But anyway, he has a lot of valuable stuff. Okay, these are the treasuries the king himself has given him, and they're going to be donating this to the temple. And they've got to get there to the temple with this exact amount of stuff. They're going to weigh it here, they're going to make a record of it, and when they get to the temple and offer it to the temple, they're going to make another record of it and make sure that the 2 records match, and everything they had to start off with is presented to the temple as it's supposed to be. Otherwise, there's going to be problems. I said to them, you as well as these articles are consecrated to the Lord. The silver and gold are a free will offering to the Lord, the God of your fathers. Guard them carefully until you weigh them out in the chambers of the house of the Lord in Jerusalem before the leading priests and the Levites and the family heads of Israel. Then the priests and Levites received the silver and gold and sacred articles that had been weighed out to be taken to the house of our God in Jerusalem. So they've got to make sure that gets there. They have weighed it out, they have recorded the weight, and these men are in charge of making sure that exact amount of materials gets brought to the temple safely. It's been dedicated to God, okay? It belongs to God. It doesn't belong to anybody else at this point. When you brought something and offered it to God, even when you made up your mind to do so, that thing is now dedicated to God, and you've got to give it to God now. Whether it's your gold, your silver, or your animals. It's like once you've made that decision that you're going to declare this thing dedicated to God, it goes to God. And now normally you wouldn't be doing this before you started a 1,000-mile journey. Okay, normally you'd be doing this at your house, and then you would bring whatever it is you had vowed to give God to the temple or to the tabernacle in the days before the temple, and give it to the priests. If it was an animal, you then go through the sacrificial system, worship and do that. These guys happen to have the added burden of making this decision to dedicate this stuff to God when they're 1,000 miles away in Babylon. So they've got to get this to God's temple without anything happening to it on a 1,000-mile journey through a land that's riddled by enemies and raiders and bandits. That's pretty dedicated. On the 12th day of the first month, we set out from the Ahava Canal to go to Jerusalem. So they've been there for about a week, or actually more like 2 weeks. They said back in chapter 7 that they left on the first day of the first month. He set out from the journey from Babylon. And so that was about 2 weeks ago, 12 days ago. They're now finally leaving this Ahava Canal, wherever that is, and they're finally on their way to Babylon. To Jerusalem, excuse me. On the 12th day of the first month, we set out from the Ahava Canal to go to Jerusalem. The hand of our God was on us, and he protected us from enemies and bandits along the way. So we arrived in Jerusalem, where we rested 3 days. That'd be a tough journey. On the 4th day, in the house of our God, we weighed out the silver and gold and the sacred articles into the hands of Meremoth, son of Uriah the priest. Eleazar, son of Phinehas, was with him. And so were the Levites, Jozabad, son of Jeshua, and Nobadiah, son of Binnui. Everything was accounted for by number and weight. Whew, that's good. That's good to know. If we had anything missing, we would have had trouble. And the entire weight was recorded at that time. Now, it doesn't actually say this here, but I'm sure that they would have written a copy of this and sent it back to the king to let him know that everything had been delivered safely. Then the exiles who had returned from captivity sacrificed burnt offerings to the God of Israel. 12 bulls for all Israel, one for each tribe, no doubt. 96 rams, that's a multiple of 12. 77 male lambs, that's a perfect, 7 times 7, 7, two sevens. And as a sin offering, 12 male goats. Ezra really wants to make the point that he's here representing all Israel. That's a very important point for him to make in his mind. Now, actually, he's not really. Okay, literally, he's not representing all Israel because the other tribes are not actually included in this, but they're symbolically included in it. In his mind, that's a very important point to get across to the people. They also delivered to the king's orders to the royal satraps and to the governors of Trans-Euphrates. That goes back to the letter they read in chapter 7, who then gave assistance to the people and to the house of God. And they would have also undoubtedly, as I mentioned a moment ago, they would have undoubtedly sent a letter back to the king, letting him know that all the stuff had been safely delivered and was fine. So Ezra is here, and he's here to teach the law. Now, we don't actually see him do this in the book of Ezra. He starts out, we read about it at the beginning of his account in Ezra 7, that he is going to Jerusalem to teach the people the Torah, to teach them the proper ways of worshiping God. But we don't actually see him do that until the book of Nehemiah. Okay, we're going to get sidetracked here in Ezra 9 and 10 with a problem that Ezra was not anticipating. He's going to have a problem to deal with that he did not know he's going to have to deal with, and that's going to occupy the rest of the book of Ezra. But remember, Ezra and Nehemiah was combined into one book, maybe from the very beginning, if not at the very least pretty shortly after they were written. And so we're going to see Ezra teach the people, but that's not actually going to happen until halfway through the book of Nehemiah. In the meantime, we've got a crisis to deal with, which we're going to read about in Ezra 9 and 10.